All right, so we're live on YouTube, everyone. Thanks. We'll get started in about 3 or 4 minutes, about 4 minutes.
Hmm. Hi, all. I just realized I'm on as a panelist. I don't know if I got a different link. I can change it. Or if someone can, Just Strategies can push me off as a participant, that works too. Good luck, everyone.
Thank you.
Good to see you, James. So just James and Richard, just so we're all on the same page. Richard will go second now, and James will go third. So because Richard will be giving a history. Hello, Letitia. And the one of show is updated to reflect that. All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jean-Pierre Brutus. I am a senior counsel at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. I lead the Institute's reparations work, and I'm also the convener of the New Jersey Reparations Council. Welcome to all of you to the second public session of the New Jersey Reparations Council, hosted by the Segregation New Jersey Committee. Thank you to you all for joining us. I just want to let you all know that this meeting is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube. Press is in attendance to listen only. Closed captioning is available for anyone who needs it. Just hit the button. In the first part of the session, the committee will discuss their work on segregation in New Jersey and beyond. And in the second half of this session will be the public comment portion. This is the second of 9 public sessions of the council. The third session will be hosted by the Faith and Black Resistance Committee on January 11th, 2024. Please be on the lookout for the flyer. You can go to njreparationscouncil.org to view the first public session hosted by the History of Slavery New Jersey Committee. I would like now to introduce the President and CEO of New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, our strong and faithful leader, Mr. Ryan Haygood, who will give an overview and mandate of the council.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre, and thank you to so many of you all who have joined us tonight for the second public session of the first of its kind New Jersey Reparations Council, led tonight by the Segregation in New Jersey Committee. I want to thank our partner, Maisha Simmons, who serves as a Senior Director of New Jersey Grant Making at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, for making the New Jersey Reparations Council possible. You will hear from Maisha shortly. Tonight's discussion will feature remarks from the committee co-directors Letitia Smith-Evans Haynes and Dennis Parker, along with committee members Richard Smith, David Trout, Jacob William Faber, and James Williams, in a discussion that will be moderated by our council co-director, Khalil Gibran Muhammad. We'll open up the public comment portion of tonight's conversation after that. The question that we often confront around the work here is, why convene the New Jersey Reparations Council? And the answer is that although slavery shaped every aspect of New Jersey, too many people in our state believe that it never happened here, and that racial inequality is not a New Jersey issue. But as you'll hear tonight, New Jersey's original sin of slavery and its lasting stain tell a very different story. Co-chaired by Khalil Gibran Muhammad and Tajania Henderson, and comprised of local, state, and national experts, the New Jersey Reparations Council is finally confronting and working to repair the enduring harm from New Jersey's deep and often overlooked institution of slavery and its enduring impact on the contemporary life of Black people in our state. Because these inequalities have been reinforced by generations of policy design rooted in slavery, not by individual behaviors, they must be repaired by design. The council will not only propose bold, strategic policies to repair the enduring harm to Black people from slavery, but it will also answer this foundational question. And that is, what kind of reparative system does New Jersey need to build to invest in for Black people here to finally be free, to thrive, free to win? Our affirmative vision is for the council to think boldly and imaginatively and to propose solutions that will both, one, compensate the descendants of enslaved Black people and their communities for lost wages, and two, to address the structural racism at the core through reparative policies and investments that are commensurate and proportional to the enduring harm from slavery. On Juneteenth 2025, the council will produce a report that will draw direct connections between New Jersey's history and its present and propose comprehensive policy recommendations that will, on their own, serve as a blueprint for how New Jersey can repair the enduring harm from slavery, and also act as a vast resource to the reparations task force that New Jersey will ultimately create through law, thanks to the ongoing advocacy of our faith allies for reparations partners. As we look ahead to the council's work, it is both thrilling and, to be sure, daunting. But we know that the only way forward to building a new New Jersey is through. We are convinced that every movement for racial justice requires fierce and independent advocates to lift their voices when others won't. We are also convinced that the New Jersey Reparations Council, building on a decades-long fight in this state, will help to move the issue of reparations from unsafe, unpalatable, and impossible to inevitable and conventional wisdom. And we thank you for standing with us. I'm now pleased to pass the mic to Maisha Simmons, Senior Director of New Jersey Grant Making from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Maisha.
Thank you, Ryan. I'm honored to be a member of the council and to speak with you today. My colleagues and I at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation are steadfastly committed to achieving health equity in New Jersey, which means that everyone who calls our state home has a fair and just opportunity to live their healthiest life possible. Yet the current reality is that there are large, persistent, and increasing gaps in opportunities for health and well-being across neighborhoods and communities, depending on who you are and where you live. In 2021, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention declared racism a public health issue, affecting the health and well-being of millions of people directly. As the nation's largest philanthropy dedicated to health, we deeply believe in dismantling structural racism and the barriers that millions face every day simply because of their race or their intersectionality with other groups that experience oppression. As a funder of the Council, the Foundation is clear in our stance that the time has come for New Jersey to create a shared understanding of the harms caused to Black New Jerseyans over the past 4 centuries and embark on a process to remedy those injustices. We all have a responsibility and the ability to achieve health equity by striving for racial equity and treating the root cause of disparities. To do this right requires a great deal of research, planning, and public dialogue. Since 2021, RWJF has funded efforts to learn from the global experience and impact of reparations, learn how reparations could close the racial health and wealth gaps that persistently impact Black Americans and Indigenous people, and strengthen the reparations field directly by supporting organizing efforts, capacity building, and technical assistance in building towards federal, state, and/or local policy action. Now the Foundation is funding the Council to serve as the leading edge of efforts to convene a non-governmental process to initiate the necessary work. We see the Council's work as a critical precursor to achieving justice that our governments owe to Black New Jerseyans. To achieve this, we need federal, state, and local governments to take up the mantle of this work. In 2008, we saw an important acknowledgement of structural racism and the resulting harm when the state legislature passed a resolution apologizing for past leaders perpetuating the institution of slavery. But our home state needs much more than intentional action to repair generations of harm. It needs it now. That's why the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, as a part of our policy agenda for a healthier, more equitable New Jersey report, which was released this spring, is calling from the state of New Jersey to impanel an official task force to begin a process to address historic and persistent harms. That task force would ideally include a diverse group of people, including community members and affected residents who have the authority to make recommendations to the legislature, governor, and agencies, such as how to reinvest funds in affected communities. Bringing this history to light can help us shape a more accurate narrative of the impact of structural racism has played and continues to play in New Jersey's residents' health and well-being, particularly communities of color. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak today. My colleagues and I are proud to be on this journey and eager to engage in the hard work. And now I'll turn this conversation over to Jean-Pierre.
Thank you so much, Maisha. It's now my pleasure and honor to introduce the co-chair of the New Jersey Reparations Council, Professor Khalil Gibran Muhammad. Professor Muhammad is the Ford Foundation Professor of History, Race, and Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. He directs the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project and is the former director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, a division of the New York Public Library. Please welcome Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. And I want to thank Maisha, especially for her leadership at Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Philanthropy plays a huge role in seeding the possibility for change in this country, but government has the ultimate responsibility. And so in this partnership with their leadership, we hope to move through this Reparations Council forward in bringing forth the facts and evidence of the past of racial injustice, of systemic oppression, and to create a pathway and a road to build to a future that is equitable and just, where New Jersey can help to lead this nation into a better future. I'm really grateful for everyone who's joined this public session. This public session is the second of 9, of which the remaining include economic justice, public narrative and memory, democracy, public safety and justice, health equity, environmental justice, and faith and Black resistance. I also want to say again that my co-chair, Tajania Henderson, who is the Dean of the Graduate School at Rutgers Newark, as well as a professor of law there, led the first session and will continue to be a key member of helping to move this council forward. Tonight, I have the great honor to be in community with a number of wonderful experts and practitioners, thinkers and doers, people who have dedicated their life to justice, both here in New Jersey and nationally. I want to introduce them very quickly as a group and then begin the conversation with our first expert. We will be joined this evening by David Trout. He is the Justice John J. Francis Professor of Law and the founding director of the Rutgers Center on Law, Inequality, and Metropolitan Equity. He is the author of several works of fiction and nonfiction and is a particularly thoughtful contributor to discussions about colorblindness, the role of inequity in persistent marginalization, and the utility of civil rights theories in addressing concentrated poverty. We are also joined by James Wilson IV, who is the Director of Racial Justice Policy at Fair Share Housing Center. Following the conversation with James, we'll hear from Richard T. Smith. Richard T. Smith has been a tireless advocate for justice, appointed by Governor James McGreevey, and formerly in 2004, presently serves as one of 7 commissioners on the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights. We are also led by Letitia Smith Evans Hayes. She's the Vice President for Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Williams College. She formerly led the education practice at the NAACP LDF. Dennis Parker, who is currently the Director of the National Center for Law and Economic Justice, is also the former Director of the Racial Justice Program at ACLU, and also contributed for more than a decade to LDF's education practice. And our final expert speaking tonight before we open to public comment will be Professor Jacob William Farber. He is an associate professor of sociology and public service at New York University's Robert F. Wagner School of Public Service and holds a joint appointment in NYU's sociology department. His research looks at the roles of mortgage lenders, real estate agents, check cashing outlets, and police officers in facilitating the reproduction of racial and spatial inequality. I know we're in a Zoom environment, but please join me in a virtual hand clap for everyone who is going to speak this evening and for all of us who will be helping to write this report in advance of you joining us to contribute to the knowledge we need to take this agenda forward. David, it's a pleasure to be with you here this evening for this important work. And we're going to call you our leadoff batter. You're going to get us started here and help us to situate New Jersey in the longer 400 plus year of racial injustice in the United States. So talk a little bit about the history of segregation in New Jersey, and particularly help us appreciate why the story of segregation in the North is important and even distinctive from what happened in the South.
Thank you, Khalil. It's really my pleasure to be here. I'll do my best. I have about 3 points to make in showing how New Jersey's experience was really, in some ways, an amplification, but an improvement over Jim Crow segregation in the South, because it's proved so much more resilient. And I begin at mid-century, right after World War II, because I think that the relationship between segregation and suburbanization is where segregation does some of its greatest damage with respect to the racial wealth gap that we experience now and the creation of social determinants of health that have benefited communities that were not segregated to the detriment of communities that were. So the first point is really that segregation is institutionalized in New Jersey following the World War II and many of the policies that created suburbanization, like the possibility of home ownership in the suburbs subsidized by a very generous United States government. And a variety of programs did that, but they did that on a racially specific basis, excluding Blacks. And so this is really the beginning of the explosion of the American dream for most American families and families in New Jersey, who then were able to acquire their own homes in the suburbs and build that intergenerational wealth, which has benefited them ever since. The suburbs, of course, were built on zoning, and zoning was meant to be protective of the health and wealth interests of families. But of course, this was denied to Blacks. So Blacks were ghettoized in cities also by a series of other policies that were empowered by federal authority. And so suburbanization really could be thought of as the beginning of this process. But how does it happen? It happens to exclude Blacks primarily through exclusionary zoning. And that's the second point. The second point is that even before we have federal fair housing laws, and after the enactment of federal fair housing laws, we have exclusionary zoning laws, which really worked through the police powers that each municipality have, and through home rule, and New Jersey being a home rule state, to ensure that the kinds of housing that would be affordable to Blacks would not be built in those areas, and that discrimination, garden variety private discrimination, in not allowing Blacks to live in certain neighborhoods, not allowing Blacks to borrow, not allowing Blacks to take advantage of federal programs that made homeownership possible, would be much more effective. And so this was also part of the process of keeping communities white and keeping cities Black, or at least keeping Blacks in cities. This mode of exclusionary zoning, because it was race neutral on its face, has been far more powerful than racially specific Jim Crow segregation in the South. While most of that was overturned by the civil rights movement, exclusionary zoning has proved to be powerfully resilient against any kind of legal attack. So this is why we still experience tremendous racial segregation in a highly suburbanized state like New Jersey. And the third point I would just say about that is that the essence of exclusionary zoning through the exercise of police powers is justified on this notion of local control. And while local control can be thought of as a legal idea or a policy idea, it is also very much a social idea. It's a sense of self-determination and the right of communities to define who they are and to exclude whom they want. And people in New Jersey feel very deeply about this. And so as a result, this sort of becomes part of the gospel of a suburbanized state, where people feel justified making the kinds of decisions on behalf of their own community that work to the racial detriment of certain people and not others. So segregation can have a deeply lasting impact, beginning with federal programs and some very generous economic subsidies from the federal government, but can have lasting legal and political resiliency, not only through the fact that they were created on a non-racial basis, but that they were also sustained through a set of ideas that people still to this day cling to.
Thank you, David. There's some really powerful insights that I know others will help to flesh out. I just want to lift up the point, the very powerful point, that one of the things that makes New Jersey particularly troublesome in our present is the fact that, unlike many states, it has a very large number of municipalities that function as de facto cities. In places like Chicago, where I grew up, which was always considered one of the most segregated northern cities in the country, Black people still maintained a measure of political power because they were part of a large city. And in their numbers, they could essentially wield that political power. But in New Jersey, the Black community is bifurcated across these essentially make-believe local boundaries. A very powerful way to get us started in this conversation. So speaking of one of those local boundaries, we have a historic decision which ultimately challenged the relationship of housing to education segregation. And it's colloquially known as the Mount Laurel decision. So I want to ask Richard. Richard, can you tell us the history of this Mount Laurel decision, which is not a household legal case? It's certainly not Brown versus Board of Education in the way that most people understand one of the early legal challenges to segregation. What happened in Mount Laurel, and why is this history relevant to our proceedings today? Richard, you're on mute.
All right, here we go. Thank you, Khalil. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much for the opportunity to bring some comments this evening in regards to Mount Laurel and give you just a brief historical synopsis. of the Mount Laurel Doctrine. I've noticed over the years that they normally ask a seasoned, let's just say an old guy, to give the historical perspective. It must be Ryan's fault. I'm only 30 years old. I'm going to stick with that. But I'll give the historical perspective anyway. But good seeing all of you. More than 50 years ago, on a Sunday in October, Bill Haynes, then mayor of Mount Laurel Township, told a group of Black parishioners at Jacob's Chapel AME Church, he said, if you people can't afford to live in our town, then we'll just have to leave. If you people cannot afford to live in our town, then you will just have to leave. Like many suburban towns at that time, Mount Laurel was experiencing an influx of wealthier white residents who were fleeing cities like Camden and Philadelphia. Suddenly, residents of the township's historic Black neighborhood found themselves priced out. With no affordable housing options, they organized the Springville Community Action Committee, the SCAC, with the goal of buying and building their own affordable housing. But the township committee denied the SCAC's request to build 36 garden apartments. The SCAC sought legal counsel with the leadership of none other than Ethel Lawrence, the Rosa Parks of the affordable housing movement, ultimately joined forces with the Southern Burlington County NAACP, the Camden County NAACP, and other Black and Latinx residents of Camden to challenge the zoning board's decision. The result of that challenge is what we ultimately call and what ultimately created the Mount Laurel Doctrine as we know it today. The Mount Laurel Doctrine is a critical tool to addressing segregation in New Jersey. Segregation fuels racial disparities and harms communities of color. We should be focused on building inclusive communities. In the current affordable housing process that's in place now does just that. Affordable housing and affordable homes are being built in exclusively white towns for the very first time in our state's history. We have the current enforcement process to thank for that, and we shouldn't be entertaining a return to a system that will reverse this progress. Now, as you all are fully aware, we are embarking on the gubernatorial election. The gubernatorial election is on the horizon. Everybody and their brother is running. And so our challenge, our responsibility must be to ask the candidates the hard questions, the tough questions. And one must be, do they support bringing back RCAs? Now, for those of you who don't have any idea in regards to what RCAs are an agreement between two municipalities in the same housing region. A sending municipality conveys the responsibility of building a specific number of low, moderate income housing units to a receiving municipality. So we need to ask that question to these candidates, and if their answer is yes, we all should make sure that we select another candidate outside of themselves. So to date, more than 340 municipalities have affordable housing settlement agreements and are on their way to building thousands of units of affordable housing for New Jerseyans. Affordable housing is critical to addressing the deep racial inequalities in New Jersey. We know that living in areas of higher opportunity with access to better schools, better jobs, and healthcare yields better outcomes for everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was outstanding. And I'm a little bit younger than you, just a little bit. And I actually have the role of being the official historian in this conversation. So you're in good company, Richard.
Thank you.
I want to turn our attention to James, who is leading some of the work that is happening right now. And before I pass it to you, James, to pick up this conversation about the work of affordable housing in relationship to this Supreme Court decision in 1975, I just want to emphasize that when you talk about those RCAs and essentially the ability to use this loophole to essentially build affordable housing in already divested communities is the challenge of the present. And by creating an enforcement mechanism where affordable housing can be built in every county where people have a right to live of their choosing will fundamentally, at least potentially, and James, this is your question essentially, will this fundamentally change the nature of residential segregation in New Jersey and potentially open the door to greater educational equity down the road?
Thanks so much for the question. And if Richard is 30, I don't know how old I am. But so RCAs, and let's put it on a timeline, right? So we talked about the original Mount Laurel decision was 1975. RCAs were not overturned until 2008, right? So we had municipalities in 564. That's how municipalities exist in the state of New Jersey. Not a very large state, 564 municipalities. And to your point, they almost act like small sovereign states because of home rule. Um, with RCAs, those affluent white suburban towns were able to sell off their responsibility. Mount Laurel is now a constitutional mandate, which stipulates that every municipality must have their fair share of affordable housing, make it reasonable. They must take a reasonable responsibility to create affordable housing. So 564 municipalities and those affluent white towns were selling off that responsibility. And to your point earlier, they were hyper concentrating poverty, right? So, I don't want you to live here, so I'll force you to live there. So we see that this continuum, and there have been several Mount Laurel decisions, and we continue to move through this continuum. And we know that, to your question, does this solve that exclusionary zoning practice? And the answer is yes, but no, right? So it provides opportunities, but it's not the cure all. It's not the magic pill. We know that these issues are far more dynamic and they have a lot more complexities to them. When we think about what other barriers exist, particularly for Black and Brown individuals in the housing market. 2 years ago, we were able to pass the Fair Chance in Housing Act, which removes the criminal background check component from housing application. That fundamentally acts as a barrier to housing, right? And we know that New Jersey, thanks to my colleagues at the Institute who led the work in identifying that New Jersey leads the nation in racial disparities for Black and Browns that are incarcerated for both adult and youth. So we know that if that barrier exists, and we know that criminal background checks are one of the primary components that individuals use to qualify you for housing, along with credit, eviction filings, and other things, then we've also now created this new set of barriers. So we can continue to advocate for all the affordable housing. We can dismantle exclusionary zoning. We can do away with RCAs, but the field goal post keeps moving, right? Racism is an evolutionary practice. It doesn't stay constant. So when the internet was invented, we thought that it would be this thing that allowed housing to become more efficient and more effective. But now we find a way to use background checks and eviction filings and credit now to be that next step, right? So I know I don't have to draw a red line on the map. I just draw a red line through your application, because those boxes then become those new proverbial barriers. So in the state, we've done our best to um, address these barriers, and we know that these things are social determinants that lead into other aspects of life. Because I'm biased, I'm a housing advocate, so I believe that housing is at the center, at the nexus of everything that we need to accomplish. Because when each and every one of us logs off this Zoom, we will return to our home. Our children's live in our home. Before there was vaccines, before there were masks, we were told to do what? To shelter in place. So housing became a health and human service component as well. So housing fundamentally sits at the center of where all of us breed our success, where success starts to come from. Schools, healthcare, jobs, all starts from housing. And we understand that it's more than just the erection of four walls and a roof, that it actually goes into communities. How do we create the communities? Richard, briefly, I'll surmise with this, but briefly, Richard spoke about Ethel Lawrence, a Black woman that started all of this, right? So we talk about community. That community was a Black community, and in the North, I say with my air quotes, they were called agricultural workers. But New Jersey was the slave state of the North. These were descendants of Black enslaved people that had made Mount Laurel. Before it was an affluent suburb, they made that town. And we see and far too often that when we start to gain traction, what happens? Nah, y'all can't have that. We need that back. Like Richard said, y'all got to go. Y'all built it up, you created it, you made it what it is, and now we want it back. So Ethel Lawrence and the NAACP said no, and just for closure, the first case was tried on the basis of race, and the Supreme Court denied it. And it was tried on the second time on the basis of racial disparity and impact, and we're able to see traction within that. So housing has existed since we came over in ships and they started to erect slave shacks, right? So we know that housing is at the fundamental center of where we grow, where we heal, and how we become the full person that we want to be. So there is no, in my estimation, no conversation about progress until we have a conversation about fundamentally fixing how we address housing here in the state. So hopefully that added some context and I answered your question.
Thank you very much, James. It most certainly did. I'm thinking a lot about the way in which housing functions in the United States in our capitalist society as the most durable asset that families have. And that durable asset allows for the safety net that individual households can draw upon in times of emergency, in times of health challenge, and most certainly even to invest in the future, such as a child's college education. And so much of what you and Richard have talked about, and so much of the work that you're talking about, James, in terms of addressing affordable housing, is closing the gap of opportunity that has produced huge disparities nationally. For example, that the median white household income wealth is about 10 times greater than for African Americans. And a lot of what we're talking about with exclusionary zoning turns on what often white Americans assume to be really class differences, and that those class differences are a function of individual effort. And so I want to turn to Letitia right now, to Leticia, my apologies, to talk about the sort of longer story that many people enter into this conversation around de jure and de facto segregation. And that's often mapped onto the difference between the North and the South, but it's far more complicated than that, both here in New Jersey and nationally. So could you help us understand how we should be using these terms today? How do they apply in our present day?
Thank you so much, Dr. Khalil and Letitia. You had it right first time. Good evening, everyone. I want to take a step back and provide additional historical framework on the national level about the period of de jure segregation, pre-Brown versus Board of Education, which you all may know is a landmark desegregation decision in the nation, the immediate aftermath of Brown, and then say a word about what's going on today. Before I continue, I want to recognize that I do stand on the shoulders of giants, those who came before me, shed blood, sweat, and tears to ensure that I and many others here are able to be here. And I also want to thank the conveners of the council, Ryan Haygood, his colleagues at the Institute, and my colleagues on the Segregation Committee. So I'll just say briefly that de jure segregation is legalized segregation, racial segregation that has the force of the law behind it. De facto segregation happens outside of the context of the law, but is surely informed by the history of this country. So de facto segregation does not just occur by happenstance, which many people would argue that it does. And it can't be disputed that we have come a long way and made tremendous strides over the centuries. We have many people to thank for that, ancestors, activists. But indeed, the landmark decision in Brown versus Board of Education was a tremendous gain. It dismantled de jure or legally segregated practices, not just in the area of education, but in all aspects of public life. Racial apartheid was embraced throughout this country before Brown, after Brown. It continues to be embraced today. We know this. And I'm going to talk a bit about education in that context because it is the only thing, in my opinion, that no one can take from you once you actually have it. So the Brown decision came on the heels of nearly 4 centuries of legalized racial segregation in this country. African Americans endured it. Many other people embraced it. For decades, prior to the Supreme Court's decision in that landmark case, advocates were engaged in carefully planned out, thought out campaigns to eradicate both the Jim Crow laws and dismantle the legally mandated system of racial segregation. But despite those efforts, in the 100 years before the decision came out, the United States Supreme Court consistently affirmed legally mandated racial segregation in this country. 1857, you may know that the Dred Scott decision was handed down. In dicta, one of the justices pronounced that African Americans, even if they were free, could not be citizens of the United States. This was left, obviously, decision from the highest court in this country, left little foundation on which some believe to build Brown. About 40 years after Dred Scott, we had Plessy versus Ferguson, in which the court said separate but equal facilities were permissible. And we all know that the facilities were never equal. In 1927, a case that many people don't actually discuss or know much about, 30 years after Plessy, 30 before Brown, so to speak, was Lum versus Rice. And in that case, the Supreme Court specifically condoned racial segregation in schools and permitted the prohibition of students of color from attending white schools. And once Brown was handed down, where change occurred, it occurred very, very slowly. 1 year after the decision, the Supreme Court said that in Brown 2, schools had to desegregate with all deliberate speed. That is a phrase that many today still wonder what it meant. And it was not a phrase that was defined, and it had no length of time attached to it. So we saw more than a decade after that decision coming down, the Supreme Court reluctant to, and then finally starting to issue decisions with regard to instructions for school systems about what it actually meant to desegregate. So well into the 1960s here. There was staunch resistance, of course, to this ruling. Some schools shut their doors instead of integrating. Some communities opened private schools to actually further segregation efforts. Today, the fight for access and racial justice may look different because de jure or legalized segregation and Jim Crow laws no longer actually govern technically. But we continue to see racial and other disparities in education and other systems. They are pervasive. And when we look at school system operations today, many show disparities that mirror those prevalent in school districts that have not or had not desegregated as required under the law. We know that children and students are still being denied access to equal educational opportunities simply because of the color of their skin and many other identities that they might hold. The U.S. Department of Education civil rights data collection also shows that students of color face significant resource inequities. We see inadequate and disparities in school facilities, classroom sizes, educator quality, availability of academic materials like textbooks in schools that Black and Brown students attend. And students of color often do not have the same access to courses, programs, and curricula as their white peers. Moreover, racial disparities are seen in student discipline rates and graduation rates, which are overwhelmingly higher and lower, respectively, for Black and Latinx students. So today, many school operations, allocation of resources, uneven or unfair handling of discipline, assignments of programs or classes serve to segregate students, literally serve to segregate students, and in some instances to push them out of the classroom and schools altogether and into the juvenile and criminal justice system. As a side, I just wanted to share that the increase in suspensions and the widening of the racial disparities discipline gap, racial discipline gap, didn't actually become prevalent into the early 1970s. And at the same time, there was an increase in African-American students being identified as having special needs and being labeled as EBD or emotionally behaviorally disturbed. And those actions clearly came on the heels of the push to integrate schools racially. So as we move forward, I know we're reflecting, we're seeking to restore and repair. We must acknowledge that the civil rights of Black people, BIPOC people, continue to be violated on a daily basis. And we must also be reminded that we cannot rid our society of racism in the 60 or 70 years when racial segregation was legal, supported, endorsed, sanctioned, mandated by courts, governments, the academy for centuries. I'm going to stop there and just, again, thank you all for allowing me to be part of this Reparations Council, which has truly accepted this charge of moving forward.
Thank you, Letitia. That was a very powerful way to put in context where New Jersey sits in a national story. I'm also thinking a lot about the whole point of reparations is not just to understand what happened, but also to make redress and to make payment in ways that might actually close the consequences of so much of the inequalities and the lack of economic mobility. And ultimately, that is so much of the story that bridges housing and education. In fact, one story that I know applies to many places. I don't personally know as a researcher or even as a person who's lived here as an adult whether this is true. And I'm going to ask it to Dennis, but Dennis, you don't have to know the answer to this because this is not the question that I know is the heart of what you're going to talk about. But in Chicago, during the height of segregation out of the migration period, Black people not only were segregated in the Black Belt, is what they called it, but they didn't build enough schools to accommodate the growing population. And so what they did, that being city administrators, the government officials, was to literally slice the school day into thirds. And so Black children went one of 3 shifts to get an education because they didn't have enough facilities. And I just am thinking here, what happened in places in the post-World War II period when migration ballooned in New Jersey, and the pressure to build schools would have followed the individual ambitions of those students, but in fact, they got half or a third potentially of an education. So Dennis, that's a setup for you. I mean, we're talking about the relationship of the national story to the state story, and we're also talking about the relationship of housing to education. And in your case, if you could talk about the relationship of segregation and poverty to educational outcomes and how this has impacted Black student experiences compared to their white counterparts.
Sure, and unfortunately, I don't know the answer about whether or not New Jersey had those segmented days, but I know that it was a pretty common practice, and in a lot of places, even as Black growth grew, they would accommodate it by shifting attendance zones, but not by creating more capacity for schools. But I'd like to start and build on what Richard and James and Letitia have spoken about. At the beginning of his comments, Ryan asked the question of why we are concerned with this, why we're doing this operation that I am so proud to be a part of. And I know that frequently when you talk about school segregation, you'll hear someone say, well, why do we have to sit next to white people in order to learn? And the concern, particularly for the purposes of this discussion, are not a question about your proximity to people of different races, but are instead questions of the proximity and the access to opportunity. And that's what has been consistently denied throughout the United States and in New Jersey. New Jersey currently, according to the Civil Rights Project at UCLA, is the 6th most segregated school state in the country. And that has very serious consequences. Even though New Jersey is known as being a state with very high educational levels, that isn't experienced equally by all of its students. And part of it is the overlap between poverty, race, and ethnicity. Now, those are not the same things, but they do frequently overlap. And it's really at the intersection of race and ethnicity and poverty that a lot of the harm of educational segregation happens. And some of that harm comes as a result of the funding formulas that are true throughout the United States, but also in New Jersey, which link the amount of funding that schools get to property values in the school district. And one other important thing about New Jersey is it is a home rule state, so that it is essentially required that every town or municipality operate its own school system. So it essentially creates these series of little educational fiefdoms that are separated from each other. And when you link the funding to property values, if you have property values that are lower, which is where Black and brown students tend to live, that leads to really serious consequences for education. It leads to older school buildings, larger classes, much larger than in better funded suburban districts, lower paid teachers, which in turn leads to the loss of experienced teachers who seek higher wages in other school districts, fewer resources in general in the schools, less access to the higher level classes. And all of these things fit into the context of the intergenerational disparities that we've all been talking about and serve to carry these disparities into future generations. It's harder for you to go to college. It's harder for you to get employment if you live in these low resource areas. And what's interesting about the patterns of segregation and race and the way that they're affected by housing is that the experience of Black and Brown lower income students and white lower income students in the United States in general and in New Jersey also tends to be different. White students are more likely to live in close proximity to higher wealth white families, and so they get the benefit of the higher tax rate. The other thing that is important is that that housing is important, health is important. You know, as both Richard and James said, these things are so inextricably linked together that they continue to have these impacts on students. So if you look at the dramatic differences in healthcare for people in the United States, there was a report in a newspaper saying that the life expectancy for children in Trenton is 73 years as compared to Princeton, where it's 87 years, which is a major difference. And those differences work their way down to children. The asthma rates for children, the likelihood of exposure to lead paint are higher for Black and Brown students. And each one of those things has an impact on the educational experience. When you miss school because of asthma, your parent has to stay home, potentially loses their job. The student has less instructional time. They do worse. They are more likely to drop out. And that greater likelihood of dropping out translates into a greater likelihood of participation in the school to prison pipeline. So all of these things are affected. Now, efforts have been made in New Jersey to address both the funding disparities and the level of segregation. But those are efforts that have been going on now in the case of the Abbott case, which dealt with the funding issues for over 40 years and still have not addressed all of those differences. Likewise, there is the ongoing case about school segregation, where there was a pretty puzzling decision recently where the court held that significant parts of New Jersey schools are segregated, but then didn't take that next step of saying what the state's responsibilities are to address that segregation. And so you have these problems continuing and not being addressed. And a good part of the reason why these are still problems is there continues to be resistance to creating meaningful opportunities for Black and Brown students. There's resistance to breaking down the segregation that has existed. There is a hoarding of educational resources, and the solution has to be breaking that down, changing that, giving people access to living in environmentally safe areas, in areas where there is access to a full array of educational opportunities. And until we have that, we'll continue having the pattern of intergenerational wealth distinctions, knowledge gaps, and the state of New Jersey will not be able to progress the way it should, and individual students will not have the opportunities that they deserve under both the federal and the New Jersey Constitution.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dennis. I'm thinking about the New Jersey Constitution, which, as I understand it, actually has a constitutional mandate for equity built into it, which is stands in stark contrast to most states, and most especially our federal government, where there is no right to an education. Contrary to the claims of the United States as the oldest liberal democracy, a beacon of freedom and justice to the world, the United States does not promise you a quality education. That right comes to you vis-a-vis state constitutions. And some of our states, including Alabama, refuses even to strike down formal segregation as of 2023. So we are stuck with, as Martin Luther King often reminded us, that the basis of change in the United States, no matter how much legal language we put on it, comes down to public opinion. Public opinion fundamentally still determines the limits of justice and equity in this society, no matter where you live. So, Jacob, talk to us about the role of the federal government in shaping some of that public opinion. What role has the federal government played in fomenting segregation at the state and local level? And how have these federal policies entrenched such things as the racial wealth gap and many of the inequities that we've been talking about here today?
So first, I just want to thank everybody for coming on a Monday evening, and for the many people who are responsible for convening this amazing panel. And I think what I will do with my limited amount of time here is, one, echo the points that several of the previous speakers have made about the importance of geography and homeownership and racism in shaping access to a whole host of opportunity structures, whether that be employment, healthy environments. Sorry, my cat is also joining us, or home equity accumulation. And the role of the federal government is really in undergirding all of these dynamics through a series of massive investments that originated during the New Deal. So 100 years ago, before the Great Depression, the federal government had basically no hand in the housing market, especially not the homeownership market. If you wanted to buy a home, you were reliant on, you had to buy with cash, or you were reliant on these short-term, high-interest loans. And unsurprisingly, this contributed to the severity of the Great Depression, and even to this day, the worst foreclosure crisis that the United States has experienced. And so the federal government instituted a series of enormous housing policies to first rescue this housing market that was in free fall, but then also spur job creation and wealth accumulation and neighborhood stability through the creation and subsidization of the long-term fixed payment mortgage, which again didn't really exist before these series of policies, starting with the Homeowners Loan Corporation and then the much larger Federal Housing Administration, and as David mentioned at the outset of this talk, the Veterans Administration, and the GI Bill, that expanded homeownership opportunities for tens of millions of Americans, in fact, making it far less expensive to own a home than to rent in many large cities. And the core sin that several people have already mentioned this evening was that these policies were explicitly racist and segregationist. And so the federal government created this enormous financial incentive for folks to segregate. So Dennis just talked about this link between home equity segregation and funding for schools, segregation of funding for schools, and that's incredibly important. But we've also, based on how we appraise properties, we have conflated lending risk and home equity accumulation with proximity to whiteness. And I think that the really critical lesson to take from this history through the present, is that these were intentional choices that were made by powerful people, but many at the state and local level, but also at the federal level, back in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, but all the way up until today, that they kind of intentionally created this really powerful financial instrument, again, this kind of low-cost, long-term mortgage, that if you were white in the 1940s and 50s and you bought a home, it would be almost impossible to not accumulate wealth through that home. And this opportunity was sealed off from Blacks and other people of color. And we have seen because of the kind of intergenerational nature of wealth accumulation, the intractability of segregation and wealth inequality that were also made much, much, much worse by layering on kind of other policy decisions such as school funding, such as highway construction, such as the siting of polluting facilities at all levels of government. And I'm going to kind of end now, but this is not even going into the period of urban renewal, which also is responsible for mass displacement and wealth accumulation among a very select few, almost completely white real estate and other commercial interests in urban and suburban areas across the country. So again, really the kind of key take home here is, we're in this conversation about reparations, and part of our task is building a case for reparations. And there is a real kind of importance in understanding that these were deliberate choices that were made to create a segregated America and to create the wealth inequality that we see today, that we also see kind of no sign of it closing. And so there's a moral responsibility that the government at all levels must take steps to redress these wrongs.
Thank you very much, Jacob. I want to just say in general that all of us, I think, tonight have learned a lot from each other, and in total have contributed to really the first draft of putting many of the pieces together between the local and the state, between the state and the federal, and ultimately the relationship of our laws and policies as the accumulated evidence of the injury done to Black people in this state and across these United States. It's not an accident that the vast majority of wealth held by whites, that racial disparity I mentioned earlier, that is essentially tenfold in net assets we call wealth, is directly related to housing, because housing has been at the cornerstone of what generations of people who've lived in this country, whether residents or born here, describe as their most important asset. It has been the basis of their livelihood, their lives, and what they've been able to pass on to future generations. And so we have had this conversation amongst experts and practitioners, amongst scholars, and those who have been on the legal battlefield, on the front lines of justice, in making a case for justice. But this is a case about the future. This Reparations Council is looking to the future. And at this time, I'm going to hand it back to Jean-Pierre to help us expand the numbers of voices that are contributing to our knowledge about what happened in this state and what we should do about it. I just want to say I'm grateful too for the audience watching us on YouTube and contributing to a robust conversation there and following along so far. JP, back to you.
Thank you so much, Khalil, and thank you so much for articulating the idea of reparations as a future-oriented project. But thank you also very much to the Segregation Committee for your insightful comments and for your brilliance and for linking the state and the local to the national for us. And now it is time for the public comment portion. I know the committee looks forward to your comments and having your thoughts inform their work going forward. Thank you for those of you who have previously submitted comments via the website. We really appreciate it. We have had an overwhelming response. We even have a watch party going. Thank you, UU Montclair. Folks have already submitted pre-recorded comments. We will not be able to get to everyone tonight, but we still have the website available, as I noted, for you to express yourself via audio or written word or video. You can go to njreparationscouncil.org to express yourself without a 3-minute limit. There are a few rules to this public comment session, and I want to make this clear. Right? There are some clear ground rules. As pointed out in the flyer, only those who have previously registered can speak. We will call names in the order in which folks have registered. You will be limited to 3 minutes. There will be a timer on the upper right of your screen in green. There will be no additional time, no exceptions. You'll get a 15-second warning. If you would like more time to express yourself, as I said before, go to njreparationscouncil.org. Finally, as an important disclaimer, there is no room for hate speech, personal attacks, or threats of any kind will not be tolerated. You will be promptly removed from this meeting. I now want to pass it on to the co-directors of this committee, Letitia Haynes and Dennis Parker, to moderate the public comment portion.
Thank you. And we do have a substantial list, so I will turn right to the first speaker on the list, Nicole Nelson, who will be followed by Robert Kim. So be prepared to join. Nicole, are you there?
I'm here, yes.
The floor is yours.
All right. Good evening. My name is Nicole Nelson, and I'm a senior policy advisor at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. Today, I'm speaking in my individual capacity as an American historian about my research on integration in South Orange and Maplewood, New Jersey. Both towns reacted to African Americans moving in with an integration plan. Whites and African Americans made the communities more accepting of Black residents through initiatives like working with local real estate agents to sell homes on a non-discriminatory basis. Much of this work was achieved before the Fair Housing Act of 1968 was enacted. Recently, the South Orange Maplewood Community Coalition on Race has challenged housing discrimination and maintained the town's racial balance. The Wealth Gap Equalizer loan provides Black and non-white Hispanic first-time homebuyers with up to $7,500 to help buy homes in the communities. This initiative is a good start towards combating the racial homeownership gap, which contributes to the racial wealth gap. However, it might not be enough to combat the state's racial homeownership gap. From 2015 to 2019, median home values in South Orange and Maplewood were $604,300 and $527,900, respectively. During that same period, Black New Jerseyans' median income was only $53,247. Therefore, many Black New Jerseyans cannot afford homes in either community. South Orange and Maplewood's efforts distinguish the towns from communities that resisted integration. However, the state should consider a balanced approach to fair housing that eliminates housing discrimination and reinvests in Black communities. To tie this conversation to reparations, Black people face stark disparities, but African Americans, Black people descended from American chattel slavery, may have a particularly difficult time affording a home not only in the two towns, but also in New Jersey. A 2022 Pew Research Center study reveals that nationally, African Americans have worse outcomes than Black Caribbean and Black African people. Due to discriminatory immigration laws, they couldn't enter the country in large numbers until after the enactment of the Hart-Celler Act of 1965. This study reveals that African Americans have lower incomes and lower rates of college degree attainment, but higher poverty rates. The same study reveals that about 80% of the US Black population is African American, i.e. descended from American chattel slavery. This data does not appear to be available for New Jersey, but national data provides an important insight. To close the racial wealth gap, you must address the particular burden for African Americans in this country and in New Jersey specifically. Given this history of recommendations for the committee to consider: 1, a data disaggregation bill for the Black population that defines terms like African American. 2, data collection on wealth and income disparities between different Black ethnic groups. Going to skip around quickly because 10 seconds left. Basically, why recommended reparations specifically for African Americans. Black people of all ethnicities will benefit from these recommendations, since disaggregating the Black population could ensure that each Black ethnic group has its needs met. Basically, I just want to wrap up by saying if African Americans obtain reparations in New Jersey and then the US, that could create momentum for Haitians to receive reparations from France, Jamaicans from England, etc. And I hope the committee considers this reparations claim as true Pan-Africanism rooted in mutual respect and cultural understanding instead of false Pan-Africanism that treats us as a monolith and muddles our specific ethnic groups' claims to reparations. I want to thank the Institute for this invitation and the Committee on Segregation in New Jersey for the opportunity to provide this testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. And we will have an opportunity for the panel members to ask the first three speakers any questions they have. So please do hang around. Robert Kim, are you on?
Yes, I am. Thank you. It's so good to see you, Dennis, and some other familiar faces here after a long time. Very briefly, I'm Bob Kim. I am the new Executive Director of Education Law Center here in New Jersey. ELC pursues justice and equity for public school students by enforcing their right to a high-quality education in safe, equitable, non-discriminatory, integrated, and well-funded learning environments. I'm here to give a brief update about the New Jersey school desegregation case that I'm sure many of you already are deeply familiar with. But in a nutshell, the context here, as we all know, New Jersey's has the fifth, 70 years after Brown versus Board, New Jersey has the fifth highest level of intense segregation among Black students and the fourth highest level among all the states for Latino students. This entrenched school segregation in New Jersey was a subject of the Latino Action Network versus State case filed nearly 5 years ago on behalf of Latino Action Network, the NAACP, Latino Coalition, Urban League of Essex County, United Methodist Church, and 9 individual students. In October of this year, the New Jersey Superior Court essentially, it did two things. It did affirm that the state has a constitutional obligation to address desegregation, and it rejected most of the state's offenses, but it did not issue a definitive ruling making findings that would enable the lawyers to enter the remedy phase. ELC, by the way, recently just joined the case as co-counsel on behalf of plaintiffs. So right now, what is happening is that in light of the decision, ELC, along with the other co-counsel in the case, are entered into a confidential mediation process with the state. That process is now underway. I'm not allowed to talk about what's going on in the mediation because the process has just begun. But I am able to say that we do want community feedback on what remedies would be the most effective to advance desegregation and true integration in New Jersey public schools. We're talking about that those remedies could include statewide policies, programs, research, planning, enhanced leadership on this issue by the state, of course, community engagement, and as well as, really discussion of many inter-district options on that would facilitate inter-district movement of students, but also really remedies within schools and within districts also to ensure not just desegregation of students, but true integration of students. So we really want feedback from the public on this, and that's really why I'm here to provide my testimony.
Thank you so much, Robert. And as I said, we will have a chance for the panelists to ask you and the other two speakers any questions they have. Matt Malexko, are you here?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Good evening, everyone. My name is Matt Malechko. I'm a doctoral candidate at Princeton University studying integration, housing, and inequality, including the role of zoning and land use policies in maintaining segregation and the racial inequities it produces, which is what I'll speak about tonight. We know that segregation is deeply entrenched in New Jersey, and it's important that we acknowledge this, but I think it's also worth acknowledging that the segregation is even more than the results of past injustices or the legacy of those past injustices. It's also maintained by ongoing policies like our restrictive zoning and land use policies that make it difficult, infeasible, or outright illegal to develop the multifamily and affordable homes that many in New Jersey desperately need. And this is particularly true in highly resourced communities. These restrictive zoning and land use policies, otherwise known as exclusionary zoning, include a wide array of practices such as single-family zoning restrictions, but also minimum lot size requirements and many more. Research indicates that the earliest forms of zoning and land use policies were explicitly racist in their implementation and evolved into an ostensibly race-neutral way of segregating land uses after the Buchanan versus Worley 1916 Supreme Court outlawed racial zoning. Yet the effects of these laws have never been race neutral. Decades of research makes abundantly clear that these policies generally restrict the density and inflate the price of housing, which further commodifies housing and makes it increasingly inaccessible and unaffordable to low and moderate income households, which disproportionately impacts Black households. Finally, my own research indicates that exclusionary zoning can aggravate material hardship across municipal borders, and that the practice is a particular problem in New Jersey. 3 of the top most exclusionary metro areas are in New Jersey. That includes the Trenton, Princeton, Ewing metro area, the Atlantic City, Hamilton metro area, and the New York City metro area, which incorporates large portions of northern New Jersey. The good news is that we also have evidence, policies, and practices that effectively combat exclusionary zoning and promote fair and affordable housing. The Mount Laurel Doctrine, inspired by Black civil rights activists and advocates like Ethel Lawrence, is a standard bearer for fair housing in the United States. My research with the Fair Share Housing Center has indicated that since the state courts have started rigorously enforcing the doctrine's provision in 2015, multifamily and affordable housing construction through municipal fair share plans has grown considerably, leading to almost 70,000 units of new housing since 2015, including over 20,000 units of low and moderate income housing. Exclusionary zoning is a tool all too often used to thwart affordable housing and integration. It is at odds with a fair and equitable society. Ending the practice and affirmatively furthering fair housing and enforcing fair housing efforts like the Mount Laurel Doctrine is an important part of repairing the injustices of our past housing policies and promoting a more racially just and equitable future. Thank you for allowing me to testify tonight, and thank you for the important work you are all doing. Please let me know if I can support the efforts of the Segregation in New Jersey Committee or the New Jersey Reparations Council in any way. Thank you again, and I hope you all have a good evening.
Thank you, Matt. Any questions for any of the 3 speakers? Letitia, you want to take the next group?
Absolutely. I'm happy to do that. And we have Hanif Davis. If you're there, you're going to be up, and Talisa Kelly you're going to be next. Hanif?
I'm sorry, Hanif isn't
Okay.
actually there. We have a Qadir
Okay. Qadir, that would be.
Qadir Abdul Salam.
Hey, what's going on? Can you guys hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Hey, what's going on? Hey, I just want to say a few things. One, we got to make sure that reparations are lineage based for foundational Black Americans specifically. Slavery, Jim Crow, and all that only happened to foundational Black Americans, also known as freemen legislatively. No other group has been through the atrocities that we've been through. Another thing is that if you go by race, it always gets stricken down in the Supreme Court. We don't need it to be race based. Not every Black group here in the U.S. went through slavery. Only foundational Black Americans have. Secondly, I've also seen a lot of talk of Black and Brown. Listen, again, reparations happen to foundational Black Americans. Nothing against my brothers and sisters, the people in the Brown community, but this wasn't their struggle. This didn't happen to them. I wish them the best in all of their fights, but this is specifically for foundational Black Americans. When other groups get things that's specifically for them, like the agents with the internment camps from World War II, they got reparations just for them. Anytime there's restitution that's stored to any other group, is always specifically for them. even illegal aliens, when they come in, they don't even have to vote, and they get things that we can't even get. Okay. I also want to say that I've heard one of the panelists say that reparations, we have to develop a moral case. Listen, it's not just a moral case; it's also a legal case too. It's by law, the U.S. government has to restore people that it's done harm to. So it's not just a moral case; it's also a legal case. It could be done legally as well. And another thing, I hear the talk of housing, education, all the stuff that people are bringing up. But listen, if we get our own reparations with cash, we can take the cash. It has to be cash based, and we can do what we want with it. If we want to go to school with it, we could go to school with it. A lot of us go to school now. It's not like we're not going to school. I'm an engineer, so cash reparations, it has to start with cash. Everything else could come after. And I'm gonna end with that.
Thank you so much. And Hanif, I believe you are here.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And I appreciate the last brother saying what he said. I wholeheartedly agree with him. Something I'm just trying to figure out as I hear a lot of what's going on, are we ever going to get told a lot of the panel's backgrounds or where they're from? And I'm only asking that so we just know the integrity of what we're fighting for is very honest and true. And the last one I want to ask, what are we doing to make sure Scutari and Coughlin are aware of this? Because they did say to NJ.com that they have no idea what reparations are. And for anybody who doesn't know, Scutari is the Senate Democratic president and Coughlin's the speaker. So I appreciate what everybody's doing, but I really, really hope that we're doing an honest just of making sure that this is put in their face. I confronted some of the leaders who are on S386, and they pretty much told me you have to pressure them. So if the Senate are saying that to myself, and there's another person who's on here, I won't say his name, I'll let him speak for himself. But if they're saying that to us, what is this panel and council doing to make sure they're going to confront, not necessarily confront in a very disrespectful way, but to make sure that Scutari and Coughlin are educated enough to put this on the floor? Because right now, they're not paying it any mind. And that's all I have to say. So thank you for giving me the time.
Thank you very much. I wanted to turn it over to Marianne. I believe you're on. Dagenhart? Marianne? Okay. Is Iris on or Talisa? Okay, I see Marianne.
Okay, there I go. Unmuted. Okay. Thank you. I'm Marianne Dagenhart, one of the co-founders of Embracing Race, the Conversation. A few weeks ago, the town of Haddonfield, New Jersey, finally broke ground on 20 affordable rental housing units. That was a big deal for Haddonfield. It took almost 20 years for that to happen. 20 years. What took so long? Was it apathy, resistance, fear? Perhaps it's what Minnie Jean Brown Trickey, one of the Little Rock Nine, refers to as profound intentional ignorance. And while affordable housing rentals do not address racial disparities and generational wealth, they can be a great step toward addressing segregation. Here are some quick facts from the U.S. Census Bureau website that illustrate segregation in Camden County. Based on population estimates as of July 2022, those who identify as Black.
Well, let me go. Let me go on that one.
I'm going to continue.
You can continue.
Okay. Those who identify as Black or African American alone make up 42.9% of Camden's population. A mere 6 miles away in Haddonfield, that number is 1.1%. And those who identify as white alone, non-Hispanic, make up 4.1% of Camden's population, and that number in Haddonfield is 90.2%. Segregation does not stop there. In Collingswood, where I live, it exists within our town's borders. Proficiency rates at one of our schools, the one closest to an apartment complex where most of Collingswood's Black residents live, were a disheartening 37% for math and 32% for reading, while proficiency rates at another school in town were 50 percentage points higher. Collingswood's Board of Ed and a group of dedicated community members are working aggressively to address these racial disparities. As noted by Richard Rothstein in The Color of Law, racially explicit policies of federal, state, and local governments defined where whites and African Americans should live. Today's racial segregation is not the unintended consequence of individual choices, but of unhidden public policy that explicitly segregated every metropolitan area in the US. But there is no valid reason to maintain segregated status today, and yet we do. Looking through the lens of reparation, I see education as a critical component in addressing segregation. I believe that as more and more people come to know and understand the legacy of slavery in our state, acknowledge that we have been hoodwinked by white supremacy, and embrace our own agency to transform the myth and fears that keep us segregated, we can move closer, but it will require racial humility and the will to put aside profound intentional ignorance and bravely step into truth. Thank you.
Thank you. Committee members, we just wanted to give an opportunity or panelists to respond to any of the comments.
I thought I would jump in as co-chair in general and just say that we as a council are very appreciative of everyone participating and indeed recognize some of the complexities in the broader debate about who has standing for reparations. I want to assure at least those folks here and as part of the official record that Black Americans are centered in this conversation. It is fundamental, and as one of our speakers noted, that so-called foundational Black Americans did experience a unique form of systemic oppression that leveraged and financed the wealth of this nation for both the colonial period, the antebellum period, and for many, many years longer than freedom has existed for Black Americans in this country. I'll just note that none of us are in a position today to write the report as it will be written in the future. I do want to recognize that the complexities of segregation after the period of slavery do increasingly draw in many additional groups that experience forms of systemic oppression. And I can speak for myself here. We hope that whatever set of recommendations we make will provide some solution to the legacy effects of those problems as well. And I want to also acknowledge the comment about the Senate President, Scutari, as well as House Senate Speaker Coughlin. And while I don't want to relitigate what they've said in the past, I do appreciate as a co-chair here that what we are doing is part of an effort to bring more and more residents of this state into this conversation. The issue of segregation, the issue of racism is a political issue as it has always been. And as a consequence, the more of us who participate in these public sessions, the more support that you give to this process, the more power we have as a body to be able to move this needle forward. Thank you.
And David, you had?
Yeah, is that me?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to respond a little bit to the question about Laurel and its role. You know, just sort of put something out there. I'm not speaking on behalf of the entire council. I'm not speaking on behalf of the segregation committee or even intimating what would belong in our report. But I do want to raise this question. You know, does Mount Laurel somehow intersect with a racial reparations project, or does it run parallel? And my sense is that it runs somewhat parallel, despite some of the comments that have been made. And I'm not critical of those comments, but I do want to point out that Mount Laurel is not a race-based doctrine. And the integration that is imagined by Mount Laurel, notwithstanding its historical roots in Black communities being excluded from the town of Mount Laurel was really never designed to remedy racial segregation. It was, in fact, based on a theory in the state constitution about the necessity of providing within every municipality in the state the fair share of regional need for affordable housing. That's a class-based notion. It's not a race-based notion. And so we have to ask ourselves, ever since 1975, when the first Mount Laurel opinion is delivered by the Supreme Court, 1985, when the legislature decides to codify the doctrine in the state's Fair Housing Act, how effective has Mount Laurel been at actually eradicating the state's history of racial segregation in housing? Not just economic segregation in housing, but racial discrimination and segregation in housing. And I would submit that it's not been terribly effective, but that all the facts have yet to be seen. And if it hasn't been that effective, then I think it's appropriate for groups like this and conversations like this to recognize that whatever is good about Mount Laurel, and I would argue a lot is good about Mount Laurel, it is not necessarily a tool of racial reparations. It may be a model for racial reparations. It may even be an argument for why you need racial reparations when it comes to racially disparate housing wealth. But to me, it is not a remedy for the need for racial reparations, and it was really never intended to be that.
I'm just going to jump in here briefly, and thank you, Khalil and David, for your wonderful, insightful comments. I'm really just going to, second some of the comments made by Khalil that yes, this conversation is specifically about Black folks. But I just want to reiterate that we do have an expansive notion of reparations here on the council. And yes, that includes both eligibility, both in terms of what reparations will address. It will address a number of different areas. Yes, folks may disagree and have alternative notions of reparations, but that's why our expansive notion of reparations includes those who may disagree, and we're welcome to those who have different viewpoints, and we're welcoming that in our public comment portion. So thank you for your commentary. Also, in regard to the gentleman who had raised Guattari and Coughlin, the Institute, along with our NJ Faith Allies for Reparations, are still organizing for the legislative task force bill. We are still putting pressure on the legislature, including those two gentlemen, to pass the task force bill. So if you are interested and involved and would like to be involved in that effort, please contact the Institute and we can involve you in that effort if you would like, if you would be involved in that day-to-day practice. But second, I just want to reiterate that, we are open to different ideas, but we have an expansive notion, both in terms of eligibility and in terms, and this is why we have 9 different committees around different subject matters to reconsider what reparations is in this context. And to David's point, that requires a creative in thinking about whether previous policies are truly reparative around issues of race. And so that requires some creative and some bold thinking, which we're trying to do here on the council.
All right. Thanks very much. We're gonna keep moving with public comments and ask Jane if you're up, Jane Gartner. And we're gonna follow Jane with Jennifer Maid.
Hi, is my audio good?
Yes.
Great, thank you. I'm Jane Gertner. I live in West Orange, and I currently experience West Orange as integrated. But when I travel to other Essex and Morris towns, as I did on Saturday to see a community concert in Chatham, 95% of the audience seemed to be white. We know the causes of modern day racial segregation. It's just been clearly outlined by all of your panelists. But in 1988, I had a Montclair realtor steer me to an upper part of Montclair. So racial segregation should be addressed by consolidating duplicative municipal services, school districts, and other areas where it makes sense. There are too many duplicated services in our state. I know this is not welcomed in many communities, but progress can be made by creating more affordable housing. The 1983 Mount Laurel decision mandated affordable housing, but it wasn't being done. So the 2015 New Jersey Supreme Court decision is attempting to make towns adhere to the law. So we're seeing some progress, but my God, it's so slow. The effects of racial segregation are a continued divide in our country, which keeps people in separate neighborhoods, which impedes the progress for us to be the state where everybody can be their full selves. Integration allows people to learn empathy and enhances our communities to be places where everyone can thrive and where resources are shared and all are cared for properly. I believe an integrated community is a healthier community. We are making progress by discussing reparations and bringing the issue to public awareness. I'm going to quote Dr. De La Cruz of the Latino Action Network Foundation. He said, "Housing is at the center of almost all racial disparities, and without a safe, healthy, and affordable place to call home, no individual, family, or community can thrive." I thank you for moving the reparations discussion ahead and look forward to the rest of the program.
Thank you. Jennifer Maid. Okay, Jennifer, I think has disappeared. Is Alice Levine available?
Hi, I'm Alice. I actually didn't remember that I had volunteered to speak, so I don't have a prepared statement. But I don't live in New Jersey now, but I grew up in Englewood in the 60s while the schools were being integrated. And I've learned a lot since then about all the things I didn't know, even though I grew up in a liberal white family that was involved in the school integration struggle. So in understanding my own history, I've really unpacked how, for example, my family was one of the white families who got to buy my parents' first home through the GI Bill. So I'm very interested in, even though I'm not a New Jersey resident now, I feel like my formative years were spent in Englewood, and that I would like to know any ways that I might support the efforts in New Jersey to come up with a valued plan for reparations.
Thank you, Alice. Lisa Jordan.
Hello, my name is Lisa Jordan. I'm a professor of environmental studies and public health at Drew University and clerk of the Peace and Social Action Committee in Chatham Summit Quaker meeting. I experience New Jersey as a racially segregated state. I feel my town of Madison, New Jersey, and neighboring areas in Morris Plains, Chatham, Florham Park, Harding struggle to be welcoming communities. I observe this in the rigidity and discomfort of town meetings, beginning with the Pledge of Allegiance to the policing of public comment. It is often tense, it feels unwelcoming. It feels like we are unable to come together in respect and kindness and deference to one another. The failure to integrate our town and to hire more diverse faculty in K through 12 reduces the quality of my son's schools and their curricula by limiting the ideas and perspectives that he has access to. Segregation harms my community by permitting greater insularity, diminishing understanding, empathy, and love across different cultures and ways of living and being in the world. As a result, there is greater fear, and there is more support for police and military expenditures, which robs us of peace-building opportunities and the means to support living, thriving, healthy communities we all deserve. I experienced segregation as a train ride from Madison to Newark, where fresh air is easier to find in the suburbs than the city. I'm interested in the co-liberation of the state, my county, and my community. I support integration, fully funding and building affordable housing. I support your work, your deliberation, as well as action and funding of reparations. I see reparations as a part of a just transition. Thank you.
Thank you. Dennis, you want me to keep going or you got?
Sure, I can.
I got, you want me to take it?
Yeah, actually.
Okay, sure. We have DJ Segwan and also Lawrence Powell. who I believe are both okay. Great. Okay, you can take it away. And okay, I see Lawrence Powell is unmuted.
Yes, my name is Lawrence Powell. I'm a resident of Somerset, New Jersey, and I am a member of the NAACP here. And I lived in 3 different counties in this state, and except for this one, this county, Somerset, seems to be quite diverse. And but there is a big difference in affordability in housing, and what concerns me is, like last summer, I took a ride down to Atlantic County, and it seemed like there's big segregation that goes on between Atlantic County and Cape May County. And that really troubled me because I would like to smell the ocean breeze, feel the ocean breeze also. And we talk about affordability when it comes to housing. I think all homes are affordable based on your income, your credit report. I mean, I'm a homeowner, and the only way that I was able to get in this house that we live in, is through my credit report and also how much I was approved for from the bank. So, affordable housing, and it's based on your income, and I think just not having affordable housing is also based on your income. I would like to live in Cape May County. I like to live in Atlantic County, but Somerset has just been just fine for me. I didn't really have a prepared speech, but I'm glad for the institution and all the work that it's doing. And I just have another question: What would be the qualifications if we are approved for reparations? How do you prove that you are a foundational African American? That's all I have to say.
Thank you for that. We're just going to go to DJ Segwan and then Janelle Morgan, and I think we'll connect with the committee to see respond. Is that okay? Okay, DJ Segwan, do you have when you want to speak now or? Okay. Is Janelle
Is the TBAD task force?
Yes.
On?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Has my time started? Yes, because I don't see it on my end. Okay,
Now
thank you. All right. Thank you. First of all, we definitely appreciate your time. My name is Danielle, and I am a member of the Black American descendant community. Now, when it comes to reparations, it is not a racial repair, right? Any reparations that this federal government has paid has been lineage-based. So race actually is illegal to actually pursue, and you pursuing it is absolutely a problem. The precedent for lineage-based reparations has been set by AB 3121 out of California. You may want to check that because that is the precedent and the requirement to actually repair. We are not foundational Africans, okay? We are Black American descendants. We are Americans that have been here before it was America. We have fought in every single war of this country, and we are a part of this fabric of this country. Again, reparations is lineage-based. It is not about race. Project housing is not reparations or repair. Affordable housing, none of those. Those are all programs that are available to a whole bunch of people. Reparations, the reparative justice of the harms that have been done to us, is lineage-based. It happened to a specific group of people. Chattel slavery, Jim Crow, Black codes, white domestic terrorism, racial massacres, racial property seizures, medical experimentations, sharecropping, exclusions, New Deal exclusions, FHA mortgage exclusion, contract buying, redlining, urban renewal, racial covenants, war on drugs, mass incarceration, and ongoing police terrorism. These things have been done to a specific group of people. We're literally in an active genocide. We are actually going through benign neglect from our government. And for people to come and talk about Black and brown, if you truly support and you care about advocating and eradicating the harms that have been done, then you will be interested in working with the descendant community and not trying to steal from them. You trying to actually make this a blanket of race, again, is illegal. Race-based policies are illegal in this country. So to pursue it, you would actually be working against actually fixing the harms that have happened to a specific group of people in this land. It is not for all Black people. It is not. It is for Black Americans, the Black American descendant community, the ones who went through chattel slavery, Jim Crow, and redlining. Everyone did not. Please respect that, especially if you say you care, really here to help. Show it and prove it by actually working for the lineage. I land. Thank you.
Thank you. We are just going to turn it over to committee members or any others who'd like to respond or share thoughts. Some of the comments we just heard.
James.
Yeah.
Heard some great comments, and I love to hear the passion and the dialogue of so many people interested in these issues. I think one piece to remember in that within our country's history, particularly as it pertains to how laws have been enacted for people of color, it's always been part and parcel. Like we've had the 3/5 compromise, like we've had the 13th Amendment, but then there's like we've always had this comma and then the next piece. I think when we look at the impact of laws and legislation and things that we want to accomplish, we also have to take into account, will these things be fully actualized? Like, will they actually run the full gambit? Will they reach their full breadth? And I think a lot of times we look at the failed impact of things that have been quote unquote provided to African Americans, and we fall that they really fall short. They aren't really actualized, right? So I think in what we talk about, it's not just the dollars, and housing is one of the things that are working, but like that, it has to extend beyond that because the complexity of what we are owed in terms of reparation is not just relegated to housing or just to cash, right? So that what we're owed is far more complex than that, and we just have to really work towards completing and advocating for fully actualized like legislation and policy within this country, and not things that are part and parcel, because that's where we're always going to fall short. We have to find a way to make sure that we hold all parties accountable, that we actually get what we're truly deserved and not given just a piece. So just hearing some of the comments, and I know that there's passion and really in it, we have every right to be frustrated with where we are as a community of people. So just how do we allow these things to actually, to actually come to full fruition? And I think that's a difficult task, but just wanted to say, put that in there.
So thank you so much, James, for that. I just want to make 3 points once again. One is about the legislation. The second point is about eligibility. And the third point is about our conception of reparations. First, about the legislation. The reason why we convened the council was because we've been organizing since November of 2019 to establish this reparations task force bill. Because of the legislators basically dragging their feet to get that passed and done, the Institute convened and launched this council to have a more expansive and bold notion than what the legislature could do, but also to inform the work of the legislature. That's how the council was created. Second, in terms of eligibility, we are also seeking repair for descendants. We are not excluding descendants. We are not trying to limit descendants. It's just that our understanding of repair also includes all Black people, because we understand that the harms of slavery continue, are ongoing. Third, and I think, I just want to point out that this discussion around lineage is important, and so discussion around race. Part of the reason why the Supreme Court has been incredibly hostile around race-based remedies because of its conservative, not reactionary interpretation of the 14th Amendment. As pointed out by the sole Black woman justice on the Supreme Court, the original purpose of the 14th Amendment was to end race domination, and it was a race-conscious policy. It's because of the court's conservative jurisprudence, which limited how the 14th Amendment has been used to address racial wrongs. Third, around our understanding of reparations. I just want to point out, as the historian Robin Kelly points out in his work, Freedom Dreams, the notion of reparations has always been expansive that Black people have held. It's always been centered around freedom, right? And so the calls for land in the wake of the Civil War were really a proxy for freedom, for the sovereignty and for autonomy. And so we are in that tradition of calling for reparations expansively. And in that tradition, we allow for discussion and debate. And so we're open to hearing from folks who think of reparations in different kinds of ways. But I also want to point out that we are calling for repair for descendants, and yes, for folks who are not also descendants, but for Black people specifically. And that will take many different forms. And those forms of repair could be specific to descendants. It could take many different forms, and that's the purpose of this council, to have this discussion, to have that study. And so when folks ask me, in fact, ask what form will it take? Well, that's the purpose of the council, to have that discussion and to be informed by your comments. And so we encourage you to continue to comment. Right? We may not all be in agreement. We may not all have uniformity, but we can have unity in calling for reparations. And I'll pass it over to Khalil.
Thank you, JP. And
Mr. Brutus, can I ask you a question? Oh, I'm sorry. I'll go back on you.
So just a basic fact for both the committee report, just to contribute to this. Everyone here, I believe, knows and appreciates that Africans are not indigenous to North America. Therefore, all Black people come from either West Central Africa or the Caribbean, which is to say that Black people who experienced slavery were often shipped to the Caribbean. Some of them made their way back after generations, and some who were destined for the Caribbean came here vis-a-vis the Caribbean. So this notion of a hard line between Black people who were here at the beginning and a broader African diaspora is a false construct. It's also the case that when we talk about race, while it is most certainly a fiction, and while most certainly the Supreme Court, for reasons that are hostile to everything that this council stands for, neutralize the idea that race can be the basis of either repair, reparations, or public policy. That might even be getting ahead of ourselves. We aren't even quite there yet. I want to remind people that the notion that anyone with any percentage of Blackness was then subjected to these forms of systemic oppression also means that foundational Black Americans includes a lot of people who have more European ancestry than they do actually African ancestry. So at some point, it would be nearly impossible to determine what does that actually mean as a matter of science, as a matter of law, and as a matter of history. I'm finished.
All right. Thank you. We're going to go turn it back to DJ. Would you like to speak? Okay. Janelle Morgan? Okay. Frank Littlejohn? Jenna Patel? Okay. Take it away, Jenna.
Awesome. Thank you. Before I start, I want to say, as a member of the South Asian community, I've witnessed how many Asian Americans are often used as a wedge against other Black American communities and a tool for white supremacy. That being said, this cannot simply be a Black and white conversation, literally and figuratively. I would not be here without the civil rights organizing headed by Black American civil rights leaders that led to the Immigration Act of 1965. As an Indian American woman who grew up in a segregated white New Jersey suburban town, Randolph, with a legitimate town slogan where life is worth living, I intimately came to understand various results of de jure residential segregation in predominantly white communities. Countless microaggressions and distorted ideologies implying disinvested Black communities as inferior, the strong opposition to accountability and reconciliation of the American legacy of slavery, and the disillusion of valued principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the form of tokenism. I think the next question for me became, why are there places not quote unquote worth living in? And why is Randolph considered a place quote unquote worth living in? Through my personal experiences as a New Jersey resident, combined with my educational experiences, I was able to answer this question. Every day, I become more and more astounded by the various ways our government has implemented and enforced lawful racial residential segregation. But even more shocking to me is that the causes of segregation are debated as if there is something to debate. Without understanding the full history that has been documented, one instance of documentation being the book, The Color of Law, people will continue to craft false narratives as to how structural racism operates in New Jersey and across the country. Beyond the many promising policies and strategies, many of which have been highlighted by the amazing leaders on this council, as well as the book Just Action by Leah and Richard Rothstein, needed to solve a complex issue like segregation. We need to be aware of the segregation of our digital spaces and the monetization of mis and disinformation that is fueling these narratives, and explore the extents to which we can dismantle this at the state level. We also need to be aware, as I mentioned earlier, of our changing demographic landscape, and this not just being a Black and white issue. I think it's important to note we are a state with one of the most quote unquote progressive housing laws in the nation to this day, the Mount Laurel Doctrine. However, the doctrine has not lived on without severe opposition and lack of enforcement. This doctrine actually required Randolph to provide 643 affordable units by 2025. The agreement permitted credits for already completed projects and bonus credits. As a result, the total number of new affordable units amounts to 258. As a Randolph resident, I can assure you that the opposition to inclusionary housing has intensified. According to Tap Into Randolph, during Randolph Township Council's September 1st meeting, residents expressed concerns such as traffic, potential overcrowding of schools, and the lack of communication by the town. This is classic not in my backyard attitude and behavior disguised as a valid race neutral concern. It is seen everywhere and doesn't exist in a vacuum. We are talking about residents who hold the same concerns about CRT being taught in public schools. In fact, when you go on the Randolph High School FAQ webpage, the first question is, what is CRT? Followed by questions and answers that assert that critical is not a component of the New Jersey State Learning Standard, and it is not required by the state to be adopted as a part of curricula. I realize that I'm at time. So I just want to finish by saying, the effects of segregation are actually what brought me to the root of the issue as a public health major. The one life-changing fact that I found was that your zip code is one of the greatest predictors of your health outcomes. I believe that I fully support all the work that you do. I thank you all so very much. And just thank you for the time that I had to speak today.
Thank you. Is Ahmed Stovall here? Yes.
Hello, may I be heard?
Please.
Excellent. I want to say thank you for the time, and also for this panel. I'll get right to it. The mention was with exclusionary zoning. I want to give it specific instances. 1688, town named Wellingborough, or the district named Wellingborough, was created, and up until 1798, it was codified into New Jersey law. Fast forward to 1950s, and that turned into a Levittown. William Levitt, I believe his name was. Levittown was that during the 50s. This was there were 3 Levittowns. They were all side effects of the FDR's New Deal. This is where the racist covenants were put in. Those same deeds are still in New Jersey to today, where they prohibited Black Americans from getting these properties, a lot of times by the quote unquote brown community. Fast forward to Clark, New Jersey, which was established in 1858. 1920s, Walter Pleckert, man mentioned earlier about the 1-drop rule. All of those people of color back then, during that time in Walter Pleckert in the 1920s, were reclassified as Black Americans. In the 1990s, my family moved, had no problem affording a house. They were teachers at Clifford J. Scott High School and East Orange High School, moved to Somerset, 14 Tall Oaks Road for the person who's from Somerset. It is pretty diverse. Wanted to actually integrate a little bit more. Could afford a house in Clark, New Jersey, exit 135 on the Garden State Parkway, Clark, New Jersey, right next to Broadway. The day that my mother moved into this house was the day that we realized 10 different real estate agents had reneged her on getting this house that she could afford. The first day that we moved in, they burnt 2 6-foot crosses on our lawn. This is 135 in the Garden State Parkway. They wrote the words, no N words, in 6-foot letters down the driveway. This is Clark, New Jersey, 61 Grove Street, Clark, New Jersey. That was my first day in that town. We could afford the house. No problem affording the house. As a matter of fact, my parents paid 10% more. And here they thought they were going to get this treatment in Dothan, Alabama, where they came up from to avoid this type of racism. In 2020, the mayor of Clark, Bonacarso is his name, settled with a $400,000 lawsuit with the police chief, so he wouldn't release the tapes of how racist Clark is, and the fact that it's 98% Black. To this day, my family was the first, not the only, the first Black American family to move into Clark. The first. Clark is 98% white today. 44% of the people who are arrested in Clark are Black. 44% of the people in these jails in Clark, in these courthouses in Clark, are Black. 135 on the Garden State Parkway. People were immigrating from Jamaica there during this time when my family was moving in. To me, that's their reparations. They're willingly coming in. As far as Black and Brown, when they found out who actually did these harms, these hate crimes to us, they get thrown out. Oh, we know them too well. So I'm not too sure about any coalitions because we're not as easily accepted into other people's groups. However, if we're going to speak specifically about things, we should go directly to harms. Bonacarso just did this settlement of $400,000 in 2020 during COVID. And as a matter of fact, he's getting charged as we speak.
Ahmed, you're 20 seconds over time, so I'm just going to give you 10 more seconds.
I will land on that, but I just wanted to wake that up in the fact that this is happening, giving you a specific instance, not a program, of someone who has experienced this in New Jersey. 2 6-foot crosses burned. 135 on the Garden State Parkway.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Is John Houston? Rosemary Newberry? Janelle Morgan? Ms. Morgan?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm not as flowery of a speaker as the other people before me have been. I try to get right to the point. So let me run through these points directly. Some of these are reiterations of things other people have said. Number one, reparations is about foundational Black Americans. No one else has been harmed by chattel slavery but us. If it's not about reparations, then this isn't the committee that we all need to be supporting. If you make it about something for other people, just like we're not in the CARICOM reparations claim, there's a reason we're not in it. We're not in it because we don't live in islands. So therefore, even if I went to the island and experienced racism, I'm not a native there. So I shouldn't even be in their claim. I shouldn't want to be. But it's overlooking the integrity of other people, other people's integrity. I'm going to deal with the fact that that's not about us. I mean, what they do has nothing to do with us. What you do has something to do with us. And if you take a position where it's an open-ended flat Blackness, I'm going to let you know right now, you will not have the support of the Black community. That's the first point. Second point is, I don't know what the issue is or version everyone in here has to Black people, but it's Black people. It's not Black and brown, Black and Chinese, Black and Asian, people of color, Black folks. Black folks were harmed, African-American Black people were harmed, and those are the people that should only be coming out of your mouth on this conversation. Now, if y'all could Black and brown it in your school, you could Black and brown it and people color at work. But here is about Black people, period. not everybody else. Third point, segregation is not a problem. The Chinese are segregated. If you go to Philadelphia right now, you go to Chinatown, you number Asians, Koreans on one side, Chinese on the other, Vietnamese in one area. Segregation is not an issue. I don't see anyone running up in there trying to make them all go to our schools. The issue is inequity. So people don't. I'm from Philadelphia, but I moved to Sicklerville in the 70s. When I moved there, we were one of 3 Black families in my development. My father bought a home. We have a whole acre and almost an acre in a housing development, which was unheard of back then. Anyway, my point is this: in the 80s, white flight took place, and we were like good riddance. The people that stayed were the people that we wanted to be around. We didn't need to be segregated with them. We need to be with people that care about us, and we care about them, and that's it. So again, segregation is not the issue. Inequity is the issue. And that's what the focus should be on. If we all were segregated, but we all got, had our own, everybody had equal resources, no one would have a problem. We just get along and just move between communities, just like we do in Chinatown. Okay. Third point is, we don't have to make a case for reparations. You know what I'm saying? The Ukrainians didn't make a case. Israel didn't make a case. The illegal immigrants running across the border didn't make a case. Yet they get all kinds of money thrown at them hand and fist. So we don't have to make a case. We have to make a claim. Those are 2 different things. So I need this committee to understand that. We're not coming hat in hand. We're coming, this is what you're supposed to give us, just like you gave it to everyone else. So we're not coming hat in hand. We're coming to make a claim. And the last thing is the only barrier to home stability, which I don't even know we're really talking about houses in this topic, on this conversation, but the only barrier is politicians, whether they be Democrat or Republican. Every year we have an issue with Wells Fargo and Chase, and the government is suing, fining them because they discriminate against Black folk. Yet Biden went to the banks just recently and said, you have to give the immigrants loans.
I'm going to give you 10 more seconds.
Okay, no problem. He told them they have to give them loans, and they're following that because these people are getting loans. So our issue isn't, what I'm saying? We don't have an issue with getting homes that the government can't fix with the stroke of a pen. That's it. I'm done. Thank you.
Comments from panel members?
Yeah, I'm just going to respond on the issue of CARICOM, and then just to reiterate the point Khalil had made. So one, with CARICOM, I just want to clarify for all those listening and watching that CARICOM is seeking reparations at the national level. CARICOM is a collection of Caribbean countries seeking reparations from Europe as a whole for the Caribbean, not for individuals. So if folks live in the U.S. who are Black Americans move to the Caribbean countries, they would be eligible for reparations. Also, as the Vice Chancellor of the University of West Indies, Sir Hilary Beckles, points out, they are seeking reparations for Black communities as communities, and recognizing that colonialism and slavery were done by Western Europe as a whole and not from individualized countries. And so seeking it at the state level, the government level, not at the individual level. So I want to make that clear. And second, to Khalil's point about the complexity of slavery in this country, about people moving across borders, and that the borders that we recognize today, colonial powers did not recognize, right? They enslaved people and took them across what we consider national borders, state borders, local borders, moving goods and people and services across those borders and imposing their power. And so when we have this limited notion of reparations combined with a kind of scarcity mindset, this idea that, what's mine is mine and that those can't have it, that doesn't reflect a notion of reparations that is in part meant to address that kind of mindset. And so I just want to make that clear as well.
You can't dictate our claim to us. I respect your opinion, but you can't dictate our claim to us. That's all I have to say. Goodbye.
I'm not trying to dictate your claim to anyone. I'm just making it clear what our position is. All right.
Thank you.
Okay, that's it.
The Honorable Jonathan Drawn, and then Paula White after him if she is available. Either person available?
I think someone needs to unmute the mic. probably. Okay, Ms. Paula White is unmuted.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Good evening, and I do appreciate an opportunity to speak here. I'm Paula White, and I work in education. I lead an education advocacy nonprofit, and so I preface my statement by saying that I do lean in heavily in a bias in that regard. But I often hesitate to lean into integration as a goal, because I find often that leaning heavily into it can lead us into framing desegregation as an achievement in and of itself. And that is problematic because I don't see a ton of evidence as a goal for integration being important outside of access, meaningful cooperation, and respect. And certainly none of this is guaranteed by physical proximity. And so, I now live in Bloomfield, New Jersey. I moved to New Jersey 15 years ago, and I now live in Bloomfield, New Jersey, having moved from Montclair, where I sat on the Achievement Gap Advisory Panel. And I also led school improvement for the state of New Jersey's Department of Education for several years. And when I look at locales like Montclair and South Orange Maplewood, where there is a self-congratulatory posture often regarding integration, and yet educational outcomes are so stratified by race, I'm not convinced that desegregation is often the promise that it is held up to be. And to be clear, I'm separating that out from, the gentleman that spoke earlier about, his mother, his family wanting to purchase a home and being, denied that opportunity, and the overtly racist practices. Those are despicable. And I'm certainly not, trying to belittle those or conflate that in my statement. But interestingly, the much more working class town of Bloomfield, which may not be as much a bastion of integration in the way that it's often talked about. I moved here during the pandemic, and in the past 5 years, their high school has had 2 Black valedictorians, both of whom were accepted into and are attending Ivy League institutions. I actually mentioned this to segue into my other point, which is that both of those valedictorians were first-generation Blacks of continental African parentage. And we see this pattern over and over again in this country, with continental African immediate descendants and Caribbean immediate descendants being overrepresented in the upper echelons, if you will. We see that even with a lot of the first Joint Chiefs of Staff, the first Black president, the first Black vice president, and so on. And so I do have some concern about the notion of reparations being expansive for a couple of reasons. And I say this as a first-generation Black immigrant who came to America as an adult. So who arguably, I'm arguing my way out of a reparation benefit. However, I do so as I look at the data and think about the extent of the harms and the layers of those harms as well. And so I'm just saying, and I do realize that I just got the beep. It's true that the harms of racism and segregation have expanded to other Blacks beyond American descendants of chattel slavery. However, we should have a data-informed discussion about this. And when we do that, we definitely see that the data leans towards a distinct disadvantage for multi-generational Black folks country. And there's not a clean line to be drawn, as Mr. Muhammad stated, between African descendants of slavery in America and recent Black immigrants.
Well, you're 30 seconds of time.
Yes, sir. But immigration does select for more advantaged people to begin with. And so I think that maintaining cleaner lines around reparation eligibility represents a more disciplined approach, and a more disciplined approach will likely lead to more success. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Is the Honorable Jonathan Drawn on? And I'm sorry for mispronouncing your name, but Jasegawan?
I think we're having some trouble with people unmuting their mics. They appear. Okay, I see both of you. If someone can unmute their mic, then we can. I don't see either being able to move. So do we have any panelists who'd like to make comments at this point or minimums?
Are we able to make more than one public comment?
No, no. If you would like to have extended public comment, that's why we have the website. You can go to njreparationscouncil.org. There
I
you are.
did fill that out. I did fill that out. So you should have received that request.
Okay. So thank you for that. So you will, yes. So the committee will have your extended public comment, but each person is only entitled to 3 minutes in the live session.
Is Ka Sekimoy?
I think DJ Segwon is unmuted.
Oh, okay, great.
This is the
Hello.
We lost them. After they started speaking.
Yolanda Lewis. Wallace Winstead. Lawrence Walker. Is there any way we can tell who is on the list?
Yeah, I think we've looked through to see, and I'm not sure anyone else is present who is able to actually speak. So there are a couple people who haven't spoken, but they're having some concerns with the microphones. But otherwise, we've gone through. Dennis.
Okay. Any further comments from panelists?
I did want to say something. Again, I can't speak for the panel because we have a deliberative process. I'm speaking here for myself. But I want to say that it's not clear that politically what the most appropriate strategy would be for achieving any form of reparation. And I'm of the mind that the more expansive across historical moments that this committee make a case for reparations, the more likely the New Jersey state legislature will see a much larger constituency to answer to. And in the way in which legislation usually is a function of compromise, inevitably eligibility will be challenged by people who I hope everyone on this call, even with strong opinions one way or the other about a narrow definition of eligibility or an expansive one, see as people whose record to date has not been favorable to our goals, whether you're narrow or expansive. So the extent to which we can continue to have this deliberative process, have civil and engaged and informative and thoughtful contributions to this, knowing that there is not a consensus at this date as to how to solve that eligibility problem, I just want to offer a fig leaf of hope that the more inclusive we are now, the more likely we all are to win something later. So.
Thank you for those comments, Khalil. I want to give the panelists just one more opportunity to speak before I close it out. So I just want to give you one more chance if you'd like to say anything for the panelists.
Nothing further from me.
I just want to thank everyone for joining and sharing your knowledge and your thoughts. It's been very helpful, and we look forward to considering and incorporating.
So I just want to say thank you to all those of you who have signed up for public comment. We encourage public comments. If you have more to say to the committee or to the council, you can go to njreparationscouncil.org. I also want you to keep in mind that the next public session will be on January 11th. Keep an eye out for the invitation and the flyer. And as you think about your public comments, please bear in mind some of the comments made by the panelists, including Khalil and others, about the approach that we're taking. We can disagree without being disagreeable. I hope to see you at future sessions. We will have 9 in total. They will last until the fall of 2024, and be on the lookout for the committees and the council's final report in June of 2025. And you will see a robust and nuanced discussion in that report. And thank you for your for showing up, for your interest, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future. So thank you. Have a good night. Hopefully you learned a little bit about segregation in New Jersey, and I look forward to hearing from you all at future sessions. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.